In October 2018, 13-year-old Jamie Kloss disappeared after a horrifying night that rocked the quiet town of Barron, Wisconsin. Her mother placed a panicked call to 911. But after that, there was only silence. Shortly thereafter, both of Jamie's parents were found murdered in their home while Jamie was nowhere to be found. The investigation became a race against time as signs pointed to a carefully orchestrated kidnapping. For 88 days, people across the country followed the case with growing concern, as each new detail only deepened the mystery. Why would someone target a peaceful family in such a quiet town? And how did a young girl manage to escape from her captor? Let's look at the chilling facts of the Jamie Kloss case. Jamie Lynn Kloss was born on July 13, 2005 in Barron, Wisconsin to parents James and Denise Kloss. The small family lived in a modest home in a town of just 3,400 people where everyone seemed to know one another. Jamie was described as a cheerful, kind-hearted girl who loved to dance, spend time with her friends, and participate in school activities. James, 56, and Denise, 46, were well known in the community for their steady jobs at the Gino Turkey Store. They were recognized as hard-working, kind-hearted parents who deeply loved their only child. Neighbors admired the Kloss family, whose simple life revolved around work, home, and supporting Jamie's interests. On the day everything changed, Jamie was in the 8th grade at Riverview Middle School, where she was known as a bright, cheerful girl who brought positivity wherever she went. Their home was made complete by Molly, the family dog whom Jamie adored. The Colossus had no known conflicts or enemies, which made the tragedy all the more disturbing. The crime that shattered their lives shocked everyone who knew them. Up until the night of October 15, 2018, they were simply living in peace. Until 21-year-old Jake Patterson arrived at their home with a shotgun and a deadly plan. Jake Thomas Patterson was born in Barron and grew up in Gordon, Wisconsin, about 70 miles away. He preferred solitude and struggled to maintain steady employment after a brief stint in the Marine Corps. After his parents separated, Patterson lived in a rundown shack with his father. Prior to this incident, he had no criminal record. However, he had been planning this night for weeks. He had driven to the Kloss family home 3 times before attempting to kidnap 13-year-old Jamie Kloss, but each time he backed off out of fear of being seen. Patterson was resolute on his 3rd attempt. Just before 12:53 a.m., he parked his car at the end of the driveway to avoid being noticed. Removing his ski mask and black coat, he approached the house carrying a shotgun. The family dog's barking roused James Kloss inside. Concerned and curious, James went to the door and saw Patterson lurking in the shadows through the glass. Believing the man might be a police officer, James shone his flashlight and asked to see his badge. Patterson didn't respond with his name. Instead, he commanded sharply, "Open the door." Sensing danger, James hesitated. In response, Patterson swiftly raised his shotgun and fired a single, deafening shot through the glass. The moment the bullet struck James, he died instantly. Patterson then forced his way into the house, uncovering even more horrifying scenes inside. What began as a quiet night quickly turned into chaos, as the Kloss family home became the scene of a brutal crime that would leave a lasting scar on the community. Denise Kloss and her daughter Jamie were awakened by the sound of shattering glass and the thunderous blast of a shotgun. Recognizing the danger, they fled to the bathroom and locked the door behind them. Despite the growing turmoil outside, Denise held Jamie close, trying to soothe her fears. Moments later, Jake Patterson broke into the house without hesitation. Methodically moving through the rooms, he was determined to eliminate any witnesses. When he reached the locked bathroom door, he relentlessly pounded on it, each blow growing louder and more terrifying. Desperate for help, Denise managed to call 911, but the call abruptly ended after just a few seconds. Before the call disconnected, the dispatcher heard shouting and chaos, but the operator couldn't make out what was being said and was left confused about the situation. Patterson then violently smashed the door down. Inside, Denise and Jamie were terrified as Patterson approached them. Fully armed and in control, he ordered Denise to use duct tape to bind Jamie's wrists and ankles. Despite trembling and pleading, Denise had no choice but to obey. Jamie's eyes were wide with fear, mirroring her mother's as Denise struggled to complete the dreadful task. Suddenly, Patterson raised his shotgun and fired a fatal shot at Denise, killing her instantly in front of Jamie. Forced to witness this brutal act, Jamie's world shattered. After both parents were dead, Patterson dragged Jamie out of the house. Jamie couldn't scream or resist because she was bound and gagged. Patterson had to carry her outside carefully since the blood on the floor made it slippery. Just 4 minutes after the 911 call, police arrived at the Kloss home. But by then, Patterson and Jamie had already vanished. Patterson had quickly pulled over to the roadside, allowing police cars with sirens and flashing lights to pass by without suspicion. What the officers didn't realize was that the kidnapper and his victim were right there beside them. At the crime scene, the bodies of James and Denise Kloss were discovered. The 911 call and other evidence confirmed a violent home invasion and abduction had taken place. The search for Jamie began immediately. Patterson had taken her to a remote house in Gordon, Wisconsin, roughly 70 miles from her family's home. The secluded cabin was an ideal hiding spot for Patterson because it was remote and surrounded by dense forest. At the cabin, he forced Jamie to wear his sister's clothes, tightening his control over her. Throughout her captivity, Patterson controlled every aspect of Jamie's life. She was confined beneath a bed in his room, surrounded by storage bins and heavy objects that acted as makeshift walls. Jamie was often forced to remain there for extended periods, sometimes up to 12 hours, without food, water, or access to a bathroom. Whenever Patterson left the house, he played loud music to mask any sounds Jamie might make. When visitors like Patterson's father came by, he would hide Jamie under the bed and warn her of severe consequences if she attempted to escape. Patterson believed that Jamie's fear of him would prevent her from attempting to escape. He held complete control over her and made it clear that disobedience would not be tolerated. One time when Jamie accidentally shifted one of the large bins blocking her escape, Patterson reacted violently, striking her hard with a curtain rod, intensifying her fear of physical punishment. Despite enduring both physical and emotional abuse, Jamie never lost hope. She stayed silent, patiently waiting for the perfect moment to flee, knowing her chance for freedom depended on acting quickly during a moment of Patterson's inattentiveness. After being held captive for 88 days, Jamie finally spotted an unexpected opportunity to escape on January 10, 2019. As usual, Patterson had locked her beneath the bed, barricading the entrance with heavy bins and other obstacles. But this time, when Patterson told her he would be gone for a while, Jamie realized it was her moment. As soon as he left, she moved swiftly. She pushed aside the heavy bins and weights trapping her, every movement fueled by her will to survive. Despite the biting cold, she ran outside wearing only a light shirt, leggings, and Patterson's shoes. Her heart pounded as she kept running through the freezing air. Driven by a fierce determination to break free, Jamie's luck changed when John Nutter spotted her while walking his dog, H. Recognizing her from the news, John approached her. Gasping for breath and still in shock, Jamie told him, "My name is Jamie Kloss. They were killed and he took me." Without hesitation, John took Jamie to the nearby home of Kristen and Peter Kacinskas. With their help, 911 was called and the police arrived quickly. Though Jamie appeared calm, she was visibly lost and confused after her ordeal. After 88 days, Jamie finally felt safe and was able to breathe freely again. Deputies responded swiftly, removing her from the area immediately to ensure her safety. She provided the police with detailed information about Patterson and his vehicle, which proved crucial in tracking him down. Just minutes later, officers spotted Patterson driving near his home. Aware that Jamie had escaped, he was desperately searching for her. When police pulled him over, Patterson quickly stepped out of his car and confessed, "I did it." His 88-day reign of terror over Jamie ended with his immediate arrest and imprisonment. The quick response from law enforcement, combined with Jamie's courage in sharing vital information, led to his capture. The nightmare was over and hope was restored for everyone following her story. During questioning, Patterson admitted to murdering James and Denise Kloss and holding Jamie hostage. Patterson said he first noticed Jamie in September 2018 while on his way to work. Watching her board a school bus sparked his interest, and he decided she was the girl he wanted to abduct. Though he had no prior criminal record and no connection to the Kloss family, Patterson carefully planned the kidnapping. However, he later claimed the crime was spontaneous rather than premeditated, revealing a chilling and detached mindset. According to him, the act was a sudden decision, not the result of a long-term scheme. This explanation puzzled investigators and the community even more, as Patterson had never met Jamie or had any clear motive to target her. The horrific events left the small town of Barron in shock. Yet, the community rallied around Jamie. The support from local businesses and residents demonstrated their deep care. Hormel Foods, the owner of the Geno plant where James and Denise worked, awarded Jamie $25,000 in recognition of her bravery and strength. This overwhelming show of support helped Jamie begin to heal and offered a beacon of hope amid the tragedy. The courage of the young girl who fought for her life became a beacon of hope not only for Barron, but for many others as well. On January 14, 2019, Patterson was formally charged with 2 counts of first-degree intentional murder and 1 count of kidnapping. Due to the severity of the charges, his bail was set at $5 million. In March 2019, Patterson sent a letter to a reporter expressing remorse for his actions and stating his intention to plead guilty to spare Jamie and her family the ordeal of a trial. True to his word, he entered a guilty plea later that month. On May 24, 2019, Patterson was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 40 years for the kidnapping charge. A letter written by Jamie was read aloud in court in her place, describing the pain of losing her parents and the struggle to feel safe again. She told Patterson that despite his attempts to control her, he was wrong to think he owned her. Patterson was then transferred to a maximum security prison in New Mexico. Patterson was also charged with sex crimes and will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Meanwhile, Jamie reunited with her family and began the difficult process of rebuilding her life. She now lives with her aunt and uncle, surrounded by people who support her healing. Her aunt, Jennifer Nybergmith, shared that Jamie takes each day as it comes. Though adjusting to her new life has been challenging, Jamie finds joy in activities like dance and school. Jennifer expressed her gratitude to Jan Nutter, Kristen, and Peter Kacinskas and the police for their role in rescuing Jamie. Additionally, Jamie is thankful to the entire community for their unwavering support. Her story has become a powerful symbol of resilience and hope. Inspired by her courage, she has become an advocate for missing and abused children. These days, many people carry pepper spray or a similar self-defense tool whenever they step out. It has become almost as common as carrying cash or keys. With the way the world is now, it feels essential. But when crimes continue to happen, it pushes people, even college students, to consider something more extreme, like owning a gun for protection. That's right. Students are carrying deadly weapons. And that's exactly what today's case is about. Brian Dennison, a 19-year-old junior studying child psychology at Santa Barbara City College, vanished from his friend's home in Reno, Nevada. It was the kind of nightmare no one ever wants to imagine. What could be worse than being taken from a place that felt safe in the middle of the night? As the investigation unfolded, more disturbing details emerged, fueling fear and unease. Violence, heartbreak, and a devastating outcome became central to Brianna Dennison's tragic case. A winter break that ended in horror. Brianna, known to friends and family as Bree, was born on March 29, 1988 to Jeff and Bridget. She grew up in a small, tightly bonded family with her younger brother, Brighton. The Dennis were living comfortably in Reno, Nevada, where Jeff ran a business. But their stability was shattered in 1994 when Jeff, just 34 years old, took his own life while facing a federal embezzlement investigation. Bree was only 6 at the time. His decision left the family broken, forcing them to endure an immense and lasting loss. Though the loss devastated them, the family leaned on each other and slowly rebuilt their lives. Bridget, Bree, and Brighton shared a bond full of love and support. As a single mother, Bridget worked tirelessly to provide her children with everything they needed. Bree, bright and outgoing from a young age, brought joy to those around her. Still, Jeff's death had left deep scars that the family struggled to heal from. Not long after, they relocated to Mendocino, California, where Bridget had grown up, and the move brought Bree a fresh start. She thrived socially, making friends easily with her warm, approachable nature. Bree graduated from Reno High School in 2006 and soon set her sights on college. She pursued child psychology at Santa Barbara City College in California, eager to follow her passion. At the time of the case, Bree was a junior in college, and those who knew her best believed she had chosen the perfect field of study. She also had a passion for travel. A year abroad in Rome, Italy, gave her a taste of the world, sparking adventures that later took her to Hawaii, New York, Mexico, Jamaica, Japan, Italy, Egypt, Hungary, Austria, France, and more. Though just 19, Bree embraced life fully, creating memories and following what felt right for her. She also shared a close, loving bond with her younger brother, Brighton. As his big sister, Bree offered guidance and advice he could count on, always being a steady source of support, just as many hope their older siblings will be. Brighton truly did look up to Bree that way. By all accounts, she was a warm, joyful young woman who was thriving in college and had an exciting future ahead. But everything changed in January 2008 when tragedy struck during her winter break in Reno. It was yet another devastating blow for the Dennis family. That January, Bree returned to Reno to reconnect with her high school friends. Together, they planned to attend several events organized by Summer Winter Action Tours LLC, a company known for hosting student activities. Their plans also included celebrating Martin Luther King Jr. weekend, making it a trip filled with anticipation and fun until it turned into something far darker. On the night of January 19th, Bree and her friends had a packed schedule. They attended events filled with music and activities, enjoying themselves to the fullest. One highlight was a party at the Sands Regency Resort, now known as J Resort, on North Arlington Avenue. Time slipped away quickly, and before they realized it, midnight had already passed. That night, Bree, her friend Jessica, and their host Katie were staying at Katie's off-campus apartment on my court near the University of Nevada. When Katie and Bree returned, Jessica was already there with a man no one recognized, as she wanted to get some rest before work the following day. Once home, Katie and Bree changed into their night clothes and headed straight to bed. For reasons of her own, Bree chose to sleep in the living room. She set up a makeshift bed on the couch with a pillow, 2 blankets, and a stuffed bear. Katie went off to her own room. To give some context, the apartment had a front glass door that the roommates never locked. Their reasoning was simple. If anyone lost their keys and no one was home, they could still get inside easily. Looking back, it was far from a wise decision, but college students aren't exactly known for making the safest choices. The girls believed they were fine since nothing bad had ever happened before. Unfortunately, just because something hasn't happened doesn't mean it won't. That false sense of security led to a devastating mistake, one that Bree's friends and the Dennis family would carry with them forever. Phone records revealed that Bree spoke with her boyfriend Cameron that night. They had been together since their freshman year of college. During the call, they argued about her going to late-night parties. But eventually they made up, and Bree appeared to have fallen asleep afterward. The next morning, January 20th, around 9 a.m., Jessica and Katie woke up and began their day. They noticed Bree was no longer on the couch, but assumed she had moved to her bedroom during the night. Since everything seemed normal, they didn't think twice. However, as the hours passed and Bree never came out, their concern grew. When they finally went to check her room, they realized she wasn't there either. It appeared Bree had never gone into her bedroom at all. When Jessica and Katie returned to the living room, something immediately caught their attention. One blanket remained on the couch, but the other was lying on the kitchen floor near the back door. Far from where Bree had been sleeping, her stuffed bear was missing too. Most unsettling of all, a red stain marked the pillow she had used. Panicked, Katie and Jessica quickly called Bridget, Bree's mother, to tell her something terrible had happened. Bree's wallet, phone, and bag were still in the apartment, suggesting she hadn't taken them with her. Alarmed, Bridget dialed 911. Officers arrived promptly, but as they searched the apartment, they found no signs of forced entry or missing belongings. Because the front door had been left unlocked, investigators believe Bree was most likely taken during the night, a chilling possibility. But the details on the pillow raised even more questions. On closer inspection, officers noticed 3 red stains along with smudges of mascara covering one side. They theorized Bree might have been crying during her phone argument with Cameron, which could explain the mascara. But the stains were more troubling, and their cause couldn't be determined right away. What unsettled police most, however, was the discovery of tiny punctures on the pillow. Marks they could only describe as resembling bite marks. In other words, Bree likely wasn't just crying into that pillow. She was being forced down onto it to muffle her screams. Investigators sealed off the apartment for a forensic examination. Tests revealed male DNA on the couch and doorknob along with Bree's DNA on the bloodstained pillow. With her still missing, the case quickly escalated and the FBI was brought in to assist. The investigation was complex and unsettling. Bree had been taken from a place she believed was safe, and there was no sign of her whereabouts. What made matters worse was the fact that several women in the area had been violently assaulted in recent months, raising the likelihood that her abductor was a repeat offender. Detectives began their work by questioning Bree's family, closest friends, and the last people to have spoken with her. Among the people questioned were Cameron, Bree's boyfriend, and the man who had given Jessica a ride home. Both, however, had solid alibis and DNA results ruled them out as suspects. Still, investigators had to chase down every possible lead. On January 29, 2008, 9 days after Bree's disappearance, a woman stepped forward. She reported that a friend of hers had been robbed in the University of Nevada parking lot. It was tragic that she had been targeted, but she hadn't seen the attacker's face. All she could recall was that he was white and drove a blue pickup truck, possibly a 2007 or 2008 Toyota Tacoma. After the incident, she went to the police station to file a report and provide a DNA sample. After learning this, investigators compared Bree's DNA evidence with the DNA from the other woman to see if the same person was responsible. Shockingly, it was a match. The same individual who had attacked the woman in the parking lot was the one who had taken Bree. While Bree's family struggled to accept this news, it at least pushed the investigation forward. With this breakthrough, detectives shared what they had uncovered, hoping someone might come forward with more information. Soon, another woman reported that she too had been violently attacked in the same area. In a way strikingly similar to Bree's abduction, one detail connected all these crimes. The attacker always stole something from the victim as a trophy. Keeping women's underwear as a reminder of such cruel and violent attacks is deeply disturbing. On the other hand, one of the victims had managed to see part of the attacker's face, which allowed a composite sketch to be created in hopes of identifying him and finding Bree before time ran out. The search for Bree grew massive, spanning nearly 100 square miles. Countless volunteers joined the effort, including Nevada's First Lady, Dawn Gibbons, the wife of Governor Jim Gibbons. Since the first 2 victims of this predator had survived, Bree's mother, Bridget, still clung to hope that her daughter might also be found alive and returned home. Investigators also reviewed lists of violent offenders in the area where Bree had disappeared, but nothing turned up, at least not right away. Then in February 2008, nearly a month after she went missing, someone finally discovered her. On February 15th, Albert Jimenez, an employee at E-Technologies, was returning from a lunch break at a Reno subway when he noticed something unusual. On the side of the road near an empty lot, he spotted what looked like a doll dressed in bright orange socks. But as is often the case, it wasn't a doll. As he got closer, the horrifying reality set in. It was the body of a woman. Shocked, Albert ran back to his workplace and immediately called the police. Even before officers arrived, it was clear something was terribly wrong. Lying next to the body were 2 pairs of underwear, one belonging to Bree and the other harder to identify. Before long, The remains were confirmed to be those of 19-year-old Bree Dennison. The devastating news was almost unbearable for her family. Despite all their hopes and preparations, their worst nightmare had become reality. The autopsy results were equally grim. Bree had suffered severe injuries, and investigators believed the killer had likely ended her life with bare hands. But when police shared these details with Bree's loved ones, her friend Katie noticed that something didn't quite add up. One of the unidentified pairs of underwear found with Bree's body turned out to belong to Katie. This raised unsettling questions. How had the killer gotten her clothing? The only explanation was chilling. He must have entered their house unnoticed, moving from room to room while searching for his intended victim. The thought terrified everyone. Yet, there were still no solid leads pointing to who the attacker was. Although the Dennis family desperately wanted justice, it took investigators more than 10 months to make a real breakthrough. The turning point came when someone close to the perpetrator finally decided to come forward. That critical moment arrived on November 1, 2008. While returning from Washington State, where her husband had started a new job in March, a woman confided in her best friend that she had discovered several pairs of women's underwear in his truck. Seeing the disturbing similarity to recent violent crimes, the friend decided to contact authorities through the secret witness program. The man she reported was 27-year-old James Michael Bella, a former resident of Sparks, Nevada. He had worked various jobs, including repair work and pipe fitting, and had briefly served in the military before being discharged for drug use. He also held a blue belt in martial arts and was known for having a short, volatile temper. James was also a husband and father. Ironically, he was arrested while dropping off his son at the Reno Stepping Stones Children's Center. He faced charges of murder and first-degree kidnapping. Yet, when questioned, James denied any involvement and refused to provide a DNA sample. Detectives realized he wouldn't cooperate easily, so they had to get creative. They persuaded James' wife to provide their son's DNA, and she agreed. Testing revealed that a close relative of the boy had left DNA at the house where Bree was abducted. With this evidence, investigators felt certain they had finally identified the killer. The DNA from James matched not only the evidence found on Bree's body, but also that of 2 other victims. With this definitive proof, investigators secured both an arrest warrant and a DNA warrant for him. In the end, James walked right into the trap set by police, betrayed by his own wife's cooperation. In a way, his son had also played a part in bringing him down. A deeper look into James' past revealed he had been arrested back in 2001 for threatening his lover's neighbor with a knife. Police also tracked down his blue pickup truck, which matched the description given by one of the victims. Although he had already sold it, investigators managed to locate the vehicle and test it for evidence. Fibers from Bree's clothing on the night she was abducted were found in James' truck, further linking him to the crime. As expected, he pleaded not guilty, and a hearing was scheduled. If convicted, James faced either life in prison without parole or the death penalty. His trial began on May 12, 2010, and lasted about 15 days. The evidence against him was overwhelming. Coworkers, past victims, and even his own wife testified. Prosecutors argued that James had been near my court on January 20th, prowling for someone to attack. That's when he spotted Bree through the living room window at Katie's apartment. Seeing her asleep, he decided she would become his next victim. Since the door had been left unlocked, James entered without difficulty. He assaulted Bree, abducted her, and drove her to a remote location in his truck. There, he ended her life to avoid being caught, but only after violating her in a way that shattered her dignity. Bree had been peacefully asleep when it all began. Imagining the terror she must have felt is unbearable. In court, James' boss testified as well. He described how James grew restless and erratic after Bree's body was discovered. Even more disturbing, the boss recalled James saying that Bree had it coming when asked about her death. The reality, though, was that she hadn't done anything at all. She was simply asleep in her own home when he decided to take everything from her. How many mental gymnastics did this man go through? And yet there was more, as if it made any difference. James' defense team tried to portray him as a deeply troubled man with a history of abuse. Sure, A painful past can explain behavior, but it can never excuse it. They also asked the jury to show leniency because James had supposedly been a model inmate, whatever that's supposed to mean. Personally, the words model and inmate don't even belong in the same sentence. In the end, James was convicted on all counts on May 27, 2010. The most shocking moment came on July 30, 2010, when he was sentenced to death just 2 months later. In addition, he received 4 life sentences for the kidnappings and assaults of 2 other victims prior to Bree's murder. Every one of the surviving victims testified in court. They not only identified James before the judge, but also confronted him directly. One woman even asked him to meet her eyes as she spoke. Yet he refused. Her courage was remarkable. She understood this wasn't just about her own healing, but also about honoring Bree. She recognized it was her final chance to speak out against him. Yet, instead of lashing out, she chose to stand strong and fearless. Thanks to her, the other victim, and the relentless efforts of investigators, James will never be able to harm anyone again. After Bree's tragic death on February 23, 2008, a memorial gathering was held. Attendees wore blue, her favorite color, and left flowers, notes, photos, and ribbons in memory of the 19-year-old, who still had so much life ahead of her. Breonna's law was later enacted in Nevada, requiring all convicted felons, regardless of the severity of their crimes, to submit DNA samples for entry into a criminal database. If this law had been in place earlier, James' 2001 arrest would have put his DNA into the system, and Bree's case might not have dragged on for nearly a year. For Bree's family, the grief remains overwhelming. Bridget and Brighton had already endured the loss of a husband and father, and now they also carry the pain of losing Bree. To simply say it's hard doesn't come close to capturing what they've endured. Their struggle to move forward is far heavier than most of us could ever imagine. After Bree's case drew widespread attention, many people rushed to buy guns, pepper spray, and personal safety devices, especially around the University of Nevada. And honestly, who could blame them? A man with a history of violent attacks had escalated to murder, taking the life of someone completely innocent. Bree had felt safe where she was, but this tragedy left the community shaken, making people feel unsafe, even in their own homes. Even locked doors couldn't protect against the horror of one man's twisted plans. Years have passed since then, and I can only hope the Dennison family has managed to find some measure of peace. From what's known, Bree's brother, Brighton, has built a life and now has a 4-year-old child. As for her mother, Bridget, her journey is less clear, but I hope she's found a way to keep moving forward. Losing a husband and then a daughter in such a short span is more than anyone should ever have to endure. If you found this case fascinating, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. When a young woman suddenly went silent and stopped answering her phone, her family knew right away something was wrong. The police got involved, and at first it seemed like the mystery of her disappearance would be solved quickly. But what followed felt more like the plot of a crime drama than real life. And when the full truth finally came out, it sent shockwaves across the entire country. Andrea Ilber was born on April 17, 1991, in Flint, Michigan. When she was little, her mother passed away, and after some time, her father remarried. The family eventually moved to the small town of Otisville, where Andrea finished high school. After graduation, she got a job at a supermarket not far from home. Andrea thought about going to college, but she wasn't sure what direction to take yet, so she kept working and saving up for the future. That's also where she met a coworker, a 19-year-old named Kenneth, and before long, the two started dating. In November 2011, when Andrea was 20 years old, her aunt and uncle went out of town and asked her to look after their house. At the time, Andrea was still living with her parents, so she decided to stay at her relative's place until they came back. For the first few days, her boyfriend Kenneth and one of their friends came over. They'd hang out, watch movies, and just have fun together. After that, Andrea and Kenneth made plans to spend the next day together. Andrea was supposed to pick him up on the evening of November 14th, but shortly before that, She texted him to say she couldn't make it. Instead, she told him to come over to her aunt and uncle's place and asked him to bring along some movie DVDs. Kenneth showed up around 7:30 p.m., but the house was dark. The doors were locked, and Andrea's car wasn't there. He knocked, but no one answered. He then tried calling her, but she didn't pick up. Thinking she might have stepped out for a bit, he decided to wait. About half an hour later, he finally got a text from her. Andrea said her plans had changed and promised they'd see each other the next day. She didn't explain where she had gone, and none of Kenneth's follow-up messages ever got a reply. The next day came and went, and Andrea still didn't reach out. At first, Kenneth was the only one worried. Since she was staying at her aunt and uncle's place, Andrea's dad didn't think much of it when he didn't hear from her. But by the following day, when Andrea wasn't answering his calls either, he started to get anxious. He asked another relative to check out the house, and she went there with Kenneth. They walked around, looked through the windows, but the place was empty. Her father then started calling Andrea's friends, and none of them had heard from her in more than 24 hours. That's when her family began to fear something bad had happened, so they decided it was time to start searching. Andrea's family and friends split up into groups and started driving around nearby towns, parks, and anywhere else she might have gone. By evening, one of her friends spotted her car. It was parked in a remote area near a national park, just a few miles from her relative's house. The doors were unlocked and the keys were missing, but there was no sign of Andrea herself. Her father immediately called police, who then contacted Andrea's uncle, and with his permission, officers forced their way into the house. When they went down into the basement, they were met with a horrifying sight. Andrea was sitting in a chair, with a gunshot wound to her head. Her body was taken to the medical examiner, who determined she'd been killed by a single shot fired from several feet away. As for the timeline, Andrea had been murdered 2 days before her body was found. On the very night she had planned to spend time with Kenneth, but suddenly canceled. The examiner also discovered markings on her wrists showing that they'd been bound with plastic zip ties, though by the time police found her, those restraints were gone. Even stranger, the analysis suggested they had been removed about 6 or 7 hours after her death, implying either the killer came back later or stayed in the house for most of the night. Investigators also learned that some items were missing from the house, but the scene didn't look like a typical burglary. Almost all valuables were left untouched. Instead, the killer had taken things like a bottle of perfume, a sweater, a camera, 3 knives, a rifle, some bullets, and a bit of cash. Meanwhile, jewelry and even a small piece of solid gold that was sitting out in plain view were left behind. While crime scene techs combed through the house, detectives learned Andrea had a boyfriend and headed straight to Kenneth's place. He told them when he'd last seen her and handed over a DNA sample and fingerprints without hesitation. Police also collected the clothes he'd worn that night and searched his house. But nothing suspicious turned up. Still, they brought Kenneth back in for more questioning, and over time, detectives started leaning toward the theory that he was the killer. Kenneth denied it all and even agreed to take a polygraph, which showed no signs of deception. He explained that on the night of November 14th, after Andrea suddenly canceled their plans, he was crushed. He figured the only reason she'd backed out was because she was planning to break up with him. So, he went home, plugged in his phone, and messaged a female friend, telling her Andrea was probably about to dump him. They texted back and forth for a while, and then Kenneth drove to the store where that friend worked. The two continued talking about the situation, and eventually she told him she and her roommate were planning to watch a movie that night and invited him over. Kenneth showed up at their place around 10 p.m., something both girls later confirmed. On top of that, his phone data backed him up, showing it connected to a nearby cell tower at that time. About 20 minutes earlier, he was also caught on a surveillance camera at a gas station located between the store and the girl's house. That same night, police learned that someone had withdrawn $300 from Andrea's bank card. The transaction happened in a town called Davison, about a 30-minute drive from her uncle's house. But here's the catch. The withdrawal was made just 7 minutes after Kenneth showed up at his friend's place. There was simply no way he could have been in both places, yet detectives weren't ready to cross him off the suspect list. Kenneth stayed with his friends until around midnight, then headed home. The next morning, He tried calling Andrea several times, but she never picked up. Concerned, he drove back to her relative's house around 10 a.m. and knocked on the door, but there was still no sign of her, so he left. By about 11 a.m., he was back home, something confirmed by both his family members and his phone's location data. At almost the exact same time, another $300 was withdrawn from Andrea's account, this time in a different town even farther away. Police also got hold of surveillance footage showing the person using her card. The quality was too poor to make out a face, but one detail stood out. The suspect had arrived in a white pickup truck. But even with all the evidence pointing away from him, police still weren't ready to let Kenneth off the hook. They thought there were a few things about his story that didn't add up. First, he had admitted that he drove to Andrea's relative's house right around the time she was killed, and sat in his car outside for about half an hour, which sounded weird for detectives. Second, when Andrea's friends and family organized a search for her on the evening of November 15th, Kenneth told them he wouldn't be joining because he had to work early the next morning. Later, he explained to detectives that he'd already spent the entire day trying to find her, calling her over and over, and figured she was just ignoring him. In his mind, Andrea had probably decided to break up with him, not that something bad had happened. Another red flag came up when one of Kenneth's friends, who'd been out searching for Andrea, asked him for the address of her relative's house. For some reason, Kenneth gave him the wrong location, about 3 miles from the real one. Investigators thought this was strange since Kenneth had spent plenty of time there before. None of this was solid proof of guilt, but detectives pressed him harder and harder, piling on over 10 hours of interrogations. And eventually, police announced that Kenneth had finally confessed to the crime. In his written confession, Kenneth claimed that he went over to Andrea's that night and walked into the house. When he went down to the basement, he said he saw her body lying on the floor and assumed she did it herself. According to him, that's when he decided to stage the scene to look like a murder, so her family wouldn't find out the truth. He admitted to taking a few items that were lying nearby, but offered little else. The confession itself was short, vague, and full of ambiguous wording. Kenneth insisted he hadn't killed Andrea, only that he'd found her body. But detectives believed they finally had what they needed, and they placed him under arrest. The moment police told him he was being charged with murder, Kenneth immediately tried to retract his statement. He said detectives had pressured him for hours, hammering him with accusations until he was completely exhausted. Finally, they told him that if he just wrote down a version of events where he found Andrea's body, they would let him go home. Kenneth said he believed them, but instead, his so-called confession became the cornerstone of the case against him. He also claimed detectives repeatedly misled him. They told him they had solid, forensic evidence tying him to the crime and that he had failed the polygraph miserably. But the most shocking detail came out later. Kenneth's grandfather had actually hired a lawyer and sent him to the station to help. When the attorney tried to find out where Kenneth was being held, one of the detectives simply hung up the phone and then warned his colleagues not to reveal Kenneth's location to anyone. The lawyer spent the entire day calling every officer he could reach, but no one would give him answers. Meanwhile, Kenneth had no idea that the lawyer was even trying to reach him, and he continued talking to detectives alone. According to Kenneth, his so-called confession was nothing more than him parroting back what detectives told him to say, just so they'd finally let him go home. In reality, he claimed he had no idea Andrea was even dead. Less than 24 hours after Andrea's body was found, detectives announced they had their killer. Kenneth's friends and family refused to believe he was involved, but at that point, there wasn't much they could do. Meanwhile, police basically shut down the investigation, convinced Kenneth's confession would be enough to secure a conviction. Forensics, however, painted a very different picture. Lab experts tested dozens of samples collected from the house, including skin found under Andrea's fingernails. The DNA turned out to belong to an unknown male, and it was definitively not a match to Kenneth. Later, another sample was recovered from Andrea's car, and it matched that same unidentified man. Then there was the whole deal with Andrea's bank card. Someone had been draining her account, but it clearly wasn't Kenneth, and police still had no clue who that mystery man could be. Despite these glaring red flags, Just days after Kenneth's arrest, detectives claimed they had new evidence. One officer opened the sealed bag containing Kenneth's clothes from the night Andrea vanished and noticed a single bloody hair stuck to his pants. Tests revealed the hair and blood both belonged to Andrea. But this supposed smoking gun had a huge problem. The pants themselves showed no trace of blood, not even microscopic particles. The forensic specialist who examined the item concluded that the hair must have landed there hours after Andrea's death. Because if Kenneth had been wearing those pants during the murder, blood spatter would have been unavoidable. Kenneth's lawyer argued that the hair was most likely contamination. Police had grabbed Kenneth's clothes barely 30 minutes after Andrea's body was found. It was entirely possible that an officer, still carrying trace evidence from the crime scene, accidentally transferred the hair onto the pants while packing up his belongings. Kenneth's lawyer also pushed to have his confession thrown out, arguing that police had deliberately blocked him from seeing his client during questioning. On top of that, portions of the interrogation video had mysteriously gone missing, precisely the parts where, according to Kenneth, detectives were practically feeding him the right answers. The legal back and forth dragged on for 4 years, until the court finally sided with the prosecution and ruled the confession would stay in. During all this time, Kenneth remained out on bail, but he was far from free. He had to wear a GPS ankle monitor and wasn't allowed to leave his house without police approval. The trial began in 2015, and the prosecution leaned on just 2 pillars: Kenneth's confession and the bloody hair found on his pants. Their theory was that the murder was committed during a robbery, even though none of the stolen items ever turned up in Kenneth's possession, and the victim's bank card was clearly used by someone else. The prosecutor tried to smooth over the contradiction by suggesting the robbery was staged. In other words, he argued Kenneth killed Andrea to steal money and valuables, yet also insisted he faked the robbery. This argument was shaky at best, especially since Kenneth's family was well off and he wasn't desperate for cash. The prosecution also pointed to another detail. There were no signs of forced entry at the house, and Kenneth had a spare key. Andrea had given it to him just a few days before she died, so he could stop by whenever he wanted. But Kenneth insisted he had left the key on a table in the house 2 days before her death. His friend, who had been with him that day, backed up his story, and sure enough, police eventually found the spare key right where he said it would be. The defense, on the other hand, pointed to countless inconsistencies in the case and outright sloppy police work. They also highlighted something investigators seemed to ignore. Andrea's car had been taken and later abandoned a few miles from the house. Her father testified that the car had one particular problem. Oil constantly leaked onto the floor under the driver's seat, which meant Andrea's shoes were always stained. By that logic, anyone who drove the car would have gotten oil on their soles too. Yet when experts examined Kenneth's boots, there wasn't a trace of it. The prosecutor fired back with a new theory. Kenneth must have had an accomplice. According to this version, Kenneth killed Andrea while the accomplice took the stolen items, drove off in her car, and used her bank card. But another problem loomed over the prosecutor's case. The murder weapon was never found. Investigators determined that the missing rifle from Andrea's uncle's house didn't match the bullet that killed her, and neither did Kenneth's parents' guns. Finally, Kenneth's lawyer accused police of completely overlooking other viable suspects. From the very beginning, they had tunnel vision on Kenneth and never gave anyone else a serious look. To prove the point, the defense presented a list of 5 potential suspects, and on the top of that list was a man named Jeffrey, a mutual acquaintance of both Kenneth and Andrea. There were a few red flags around Jeffrey. First, he was the one who just happened to find Andrea's car in the early hours of the search, even though it was parked miles away from her house in a fairly secluded spot. Second, that same day he called Kenneth asking questions about Andrea's whereabouts. The odd thing was, Kenneth had never given him his number. Investigators later learned Andrea had scribbled his number on a piece of paper and left it on a nightstand, right next to where an unidentified DNA sample was later recovered. On top of all that, Jeffrey owned a car that looked very similar to the one caught on surveillance footage at a gas station when someone was withdrawing money with Andrea's bank card. Andrea's brother also pointed investigators toward another possible suspect. He admitted that he had been struggling with drugs at the time and owed money to a local dealer. According to him, This dealer somehow knew Andrea had been saving a good amount of cash from her job. That's why her brother believed the dealer might have killed Andrea to get the money he was owed. There was also a young man named David, who came onto police radar after his own father caught in a tip, telling them his son could be involved in Andrea's murder. David already had a criminal history tied to car thefts and assaults, and he even resembled the man seen withdrawing money from Andrea's bank card. Despite all this, detectives claimed they had looked into each of these leads, but couldn't find any hard evidence linking them to the crime. When the trial wrapped up, the jury deliberated for 2 full days before reaching a verdict. In the end, they found Kenneth guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His lawyer immediately filed an appeal. At first, the defense tried to overturn the conviction by arguing that Kenneth's confession was coerced and that police illegally denied him access to a lawyer, but the court rejected that motion. Next, the defense focused on the robbery charge, pointing out that Kenneth was also found guilty of theft, even though none of the stolen items were ever recovered. That appeal also went nowhere, but the third attempt finally paid off. Kenneth's lawyer discovered a serious mistake in the jury paperwork. On the verdict forms, jurors were given 2 separate murder charges to consider, first degree and second degree. For the first degree charge, they had both options, guilty or not guilty. But for second degree, there was only one option listed, guilty. In other words, the jury had no way to find Kenneth not guilty on the second-degree charge. Their only choice was to decide how guilty he was. The appeals court couldn't ignore such a major flaw, and in 2018, Kenneth was granted a brand new trial. By that point, he had already spent 3 years behind bars, and after the ruling, he was released on bail once again. Since then, Kenneth's lawyer kept pushing for new evidence, something that could finally point to the real killer. He repeatedly urged police to retest the existing DNA samples, and in 2022, they finally agreed to launch a fresh review. By that time, Kenneth's new trial still hadn't begun, and he remained out on bail. Forensic experts went back through every unidentified male DNA sample connected to the case. But once again, there were no matches in the FBI's database. So they focused on the strongest piece of evidence they had, a cigarette but found outside the house. That sample matched the same man whose skin cells had been discovered under Andrea's fingernails, leaving no doubt he was the real killer. Investigators sent the cigarette but to Othram, a company specializing in forensic genetic genealogy. In January 2023, experts reported a breakthrough. By searching public genetic databases and tracing family connections, they had identified a likely suspect. It was a 42-year-old man named Chadwick Modley, someone who had never even come up in the original case files. Detectives learned that at the time of Andrea's murder, Chadwick had been living just 40 minutes away in a neighboring town. They pulled his phone records from November 2011 and found out that on the day Andrea was killed, his phone pinged off a tower near her aunt and uncle's house 23 times. By 2023, Chadwick was living in Utah, working as a delivery driver and staying out of his van. Investigators reached out to local police, asking them to secretly collect something with his DNA on it. But there was a problem. Since Chadwick usually parked in open areas, tailing him without being noticed was nearly impossible. Officers kept watch for 2 months, but they never managed to recover a single item that could yield a DNA sample. So, detectives decided to confront him directly. Armed with a warrant, they approached Chadwick and collected his DNA sample. During the conversation, he denied any involvement in Andrea's death. But soon after, lab results confirmed that his DNA was under Andrea's fingernails, inside her car, and in multiple places around the house. And if that wasn't enough, when police searched his van, they found a revolver. Ballistic tests proved it was the very weapon used to kill Andrea. 2 days after that first talk, police went back out to arrest Chadwick. But he was already gone. Apparently, he just drove in an unknown direction right after the conversation with police. 3 weeks later, he turned up in Montana near the Canadian border where officers finally caught him. But the drama didn't stop there. While being transported to the airport for extradition back to Michigan, Chadwick managed to escape from a police van. He somehow freed himself from both handcuffs and leg irons and disappeared once again. A few days later, a local sheriff happened to accidentally spot him paddling down a river in a canoe. That sighting led to his second capture, and this time, authorities successfully brought him to Michigan, where he was locked up awaiting trial. Bail was immediately denied. After all, he had already escaped twice. Chadwick pleaded not guilty, and prosecutors began building their case. For local law enforcement, it was a nightmare. They had spent more than a decade insisting Kenneth was the killer, tearing his life apart in the process. And now, the evidence, DNA under Andrea's nails and the actual murder weapon, pointed directly at Chadwick. Investigators even tried to see if there was any link between Kenneth and Chadwick. Some chance they'd work together, but there wasn't. The two men had no ties at all, and Andrea didn't appear to know Chadwick either. At the time of her murder, he was a 32-year-old living in a neighboring town with no connection to her. Still, even with this mountain of new evidence, Kenneth's conviction wasn't thrown out. He remained at home under strict monitoring with an ankle bracelet. What's worse, prosecutors doubled down. They announced they still planned to move forward with a second trial, pushing the theory that Kenneth and Chadwick had committed the murder together. In the end, though, Chadwick's trial never actually happened, because in February 2025, he entered what's known as a no-contest plea, essentially telling the court that he wouldn't fight the charges, but he wasn't going to admit guilt either. He told the judge that he'd been extremely drunk the night Andrea was killed and had no memory of what happened, though he didn't deny his involvement. During that same hearing, a disturbing fact came to light. Some officers had, in fact, looked at Chadwick as a suspect in the very early days of the investigation. But for reasons no one could explain, he never officially made it into the case file. By then, detectives were already fixated on Kenneth, despite the DNA mismatch and the missing murder weapon. In the end, Chadwick was sentenced to life without parole. He also turned to Andrea's family in court and apologized for what he'd done. For Kenneth, though, nothing changed. His attorney immediately demanded that the charges be dropped, but prosecutors flat out refused. They argued that Chadwick's conviction didn't erase Kenneth's alleged role and vowed to move ahead with a second trial. Chadwick himself stated that he didn't know Kenneth or Andrea and had no accomplice, but the state pressed on. That second trial is now set for January 2026, while Kenneth remains stuck under house arrest. Meanwhile, his defense team has secured a well-known forensic expert who reviewed the bloody hair on Kenneth's pants and confirmed what the earlier report suggested, that it could only have landed there a few hours after Andrea's death, not during the crime. Taken together, the DNA, the murder weapon, Chadwick's conviction, and the forensic analysis, Kenneth has a strong chance of finally clearing his name. But the damage has already been done. 14 years of his life have been basically lost. He spent years in prison and years locked inside his own home. Even if the courts recognize his innocence, he'll never get that time back. And if he decides to fight for justice against the officers and prosecutors who did it to him, it could take many more years, with no guarantee he'll ever truly be made whole. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section and don't forget to press the like button.